Welcome to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. I'm your host, Peter Lavelle. Russophobia is real and impacts how many in the world understand geopolitics, culture, and history. So where does Russophobia come from, and is there anything we can do to counteract it? To discuss this, I'm joined by my guest in London, Jonathan Steele. He is a columnist at The Guardian and an author. We also have Anna Matveeva. She is a visiting senior research fellow, Department of War Studies, King College, London. And also sitting here with me in Moscow is Mark Sloboda. He is a senior lecturer and researcher at Moscow State University. Jonathan, if I go to you first, what is Russophobia?
Well, actually, I think it's a hangover from Sovietophobia. I think when the Soviet Union existed, there was massive pressure and media coverage of bad things happening in the Soviet Union, and of course it was considered to be the strategic enemy of NATO and all that kind of thing. I think where there is still some Russophobia, it's just a hangover from that. I think it's probably more actually not so much phobia, which means theoretically, fearing Russians. I think it's just stereotypes and prejudice and incorrect or distorted images. I don't think people are actually afraid of Russians. They may be afraid of Russia as a state because of some of its foreign policy, but not of Russians.
Okay, but Anna, there are so many stereotypes about Russians around the world, and extremely negative ones, I would say. I watched the film Armageddon recently, and it's a fantastic film and all that, but the cosmonaut is a drunkard, an idiot, a buffoon. The Soviet Union contributed a lot to space exploration, but we still get these stereotypes of Russians. Why?
When I first came to live in the West, in London, that was about 20 years ago, Soviet Russians, just started to emerge on the scene. There were two stereotypes about us. One was that we're prepared to do anything what it takes to stay in the Western paradise, so that we are not thrown out in the cold. And second stereotype was Cinderella goes to the market and she will behave like a Dostoevsky heroine. So everybody who read, an Idiot or other great pieces of Russian literature expected everybody to act as a character from a Dostoevsky novel.
So, Anna, it seems to me that means that being in the West, in this case, in London, in your case here with Jonathan, that tells me that Western people don't know anything about Russians if you're giving such a vivid stereotype, two different stereotypes that are not even real.
But that happened about 20 years ago. What happened then was that Russians did not live up to either of these two stereotypes. They were things which developed in the process of Russia becoming a new state and also with the new cultural attributes. And in that sense, I'm not sure whether I share Jonathan's maxim that Russophobia is a leftover of Sovietophobia. I would say that quite a lot of stereotypes, both cultural and political, are product of the modern times and perhaps of the last 10 years, and especially since Vladimir Putin came to power.
Okay, I was going to say we'll talk about Putin-phobia a little bit later here. Mark, Russophobia goes all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars.
Exactly. I think it goes further than that. Russophobia is just another variant of Orientalism, as Said defined it. It's relying on one-dimensional characters of Russian cultural reality as one of millennial despotism, contempt for the individual, so on. We can observe this sheer disconnect between Russian reality and Russian reality as represented in Western texts and media, not just today, not just in the Soviet era, but this goes back to the 1830s. I was reading a text from the Napoleonic era today from 1839 that spoke about a thin veneer of European civilization on Russia that was barely credible.
What you're saying is that that's the reference point. Jonathan, Mark's onto something here, is that Russia has been the other for geopolitical reasons for about 200 years.
I can really only talk about, what the feeling is in Britain, because every country has its different stereotypes of foreigners. In Britain, I think people actually, if you're talking about phobia, the literal meaning being fear, British people are still more afraid of Germany than they are of Russia. I don't think most British people fear Russia. They have these stereotypes. Now the new stereotype is these oligarchs, the Russians are all terribly rich, they're terribly vulgar, they love bling, they love throwing their money around, as though, everybody in Russia is a billionaire. Of course, we know that that's only a tiny minority.
That sounds like envy to me.
For some people, it may be a combination of envy, but for other people, I think, who have known Russia for a long time, there is something sad about the way the oligarchs behave and the way they get excessive publicity. So there's blame on both sides. But I do think the Russian rich give a very bad image of their country, and it's not correct in the sense it's not typical. I think most Russians are extremely cultured, very gentle, kind, hospitable people. They don't flaunt wealth. In fact, they're much less materialistic than the average consumer in Britain.
Yeah.
But the Russian rich, I'm afraid, are high consumers and very like flaunting their wealth.
Anna, if I can change gears a little bit here, let's talk about popular culture, because I still see in films this perception of Russians of being less civilized, heartless, ruthless. We had the Nazis at one time, if you look at Hollywood, they were always the bad guys. Then for a while, maybe not so much today, but then the Russians were the bad guys. Does Western cultures need a bad guy?
I think all cultures need some kind of enemy image or opponent or something like this. But what distinguishes Russians from other people, and that's about cultural stereotypes, is there are cultural stereotypes about all sorts of other people. Jonathan mentioned Germans, Jews, or black people, or all sorts of people from different cultures and races. But the difference that you can actually say this kind of things about negative things about Russian in a polite society. You can express views which would not be possible to express about other people, even if people have this kind of things. If you substitute Russian for something else, then it would be horrible. It would be totally politically incorrect. You cannot really get away with it in press or in meetings. But then you need some kind of enemy for films, for popular culture, for books, for entertainment industry generally. But if you can start, showing some Islamists and they will be, having features of Arabs or Pakistani, then you can probably have consequences. With Russians, you don't really face consequences and you can sort of get away with that.
Mark, let's go back to 2008. John McCain, we're all Georgians, remember that? And that was a time of extreme Russophobia in the media. I think it's always there in Western media, but then it was very strong.
It was stronger then, of course, because the United States was backing Georgia as a proxy state militarily with the training and the funding. But I think this Russophobia, this particularly virulent demonization of Putin as the archetype of Russia continues. And I think it's a symptom of a real othering phenomena that is different than the othering that you might see towards China and India. When Russia doesn't choose the liberal, democratic...
The right path.
The right path. It doesn't choose... When it was given the opportunity in the 90s to join and follow and be the same, they can understand when China doesn't do that because the Chinese look differently. And they can understand when India doesn't do it. But when Russia is a white face that looks back in the mirror and says, we don't want exactly the same thing and we don't hold exactly the same values you do, and that scares them.
The Western perceptions that the Soviet Union lost the Cold War and losers must follow the winners. Jonathan, what do you think about that? Let's go a little bit up closer to the present here.
Well, I think that's past. I think that was the period of Yeltsin. And in fact, I was going to come in on the Yeltsin issue because we've talked about the Putin image, but the Yeltsin image also created a different stereotype. Yeltsin, after all, had a very pro-Western policy, but the stereotype he created was this drunkard, this mujik. We all in Britain who didn't know Russian suddenly learnt this new word mujik, the Russian peasant, sort of earthy, speaks his mind, is drunk a lot of the time. A total stereotype. And that was, it was a rather lovable thing. Here was this sort of cuddly bear, and not the cold
but Jonathan,
Putin.
he was a follower. He was a follower, wasn't he? He did what he was told.
Yes, that's the point. So people, create an image which suits the foreign policy. It's the foreign policy creates the image, I think, rather than the other way around.
Mark, you want to jump in?
Yeah, particularly about Yeltsin, I think we see another of this sheer disconnect from the reality in Russia and the reality of what the West writes about. Because what we do have these personal images of Yeltsin. We also have the way that the Yeltsin era was portrayed as an era of democracy and freedom in Russia. When we had Yeltsin firing on a freely elected parliament with tanks and then ruling by dictatorial decree in the country for several years.
And rewriting the Constitution.
Rewriting the Constitution, so on and so on, launching the war in Chechnya, and he was compared to Lincoln for it. But when Putin, which is, I think, arguably, in actuality, a much more, not perfect, but a real representation of electoral democracy in Russia, gets demonized. But why is that? It's because that they differ from Putin rejects the Western global hegemonic order. He seeks an independent foreign policy path for Russia, and that's the price is paid.
You're listening to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. And if I can go to you, this is on something I wanted to bring up earlier. The stereotypes of Russians, in some degree, is the fault of the Russians themselves, would you say? Or is this an issue of poor soft power on the part of Russia?
I think it's both. I think Russians and especially official Russians did not really care about having a positive image of the country, and when they tried to do something, that came out as very clumsy and actually very much reminded the Soviet propaganda machine. Or then Russians became unnecessarily defensive on the issues of, especially in foreign policy, and showing themselves as extremely vulnerable and being unable to take any criticism. If we compare this, say, to Georgia, they did propaganda brilliantly, created a very positive image of the country, very attractive, very accessible. So that's kind of quite real inaptitude in Russia, how things work in the West and to what the Western audience would be receptive. That's one thing. But I think that there was also activities of Berezovsky, who managed to brilliantly capitalize on the mood, which was sort of already there, and managed to connect some loose ends and present behavior which is just one of the variety of possible behaviors as a very kind of typical and providing argument to a certain interpretation of Russian.
If I could give that interpretation in one line for our listeners, Putin did it. Go ahead, Mark.
You're absolutely right. One of the things that this media characterization of Russia is it denies all agency to the Russian people, to the Russian elites, other political figures in the country. Putin is singularly responsible for everything. Everything. If anything goes wrong, it's Putin's fault. If anything goes right, well, it happened despite Putin.
Or by accident.
By accident.
Oh, high oil prices. There you go.
Absolutely. Of course, the Russian economy has been so terribly mismanaged, even though it has not anything substantial in the terms of debt, while the Western countries almost as a whole are facing simply crippling debt, which is bringing on the austerity and so on. But it's not because the Putin administration has handled the economy and the oil wealth it had well. It's simply an accident of fate.
Jonathan, I get tired of it, but I still read a lot of Western media coverage of Russia, and it just seems to me that there's just this inability to have analysis. It's very presumptive. I'll give you an example. Vladimir Putin, former KGB agent, We never hear that when George Bush, former CIA director. Why is that?
Well, because as we've been saying, Putin is demonized in the West, and so they highlight that element of his background. They forget about the fact he spent some time in St. Petersburg after the Soviet Union collapsed, working with Mayor Sobchak and all that kind of thing. So it is
a person that people would call a Democrat.
Yes, that's right. And Sobchak was really praised as one of the big leading reformers in the West in the early 1990s. So it is because of foreign policy image. But I think the trouble with a lot of other Western coverage of Russia is it's very Moscow-centric. I don't think people travel enough around Russia. They don't talk about the differences of the different regions of Russia. They never talk to Russian Muslims, for example, who are extremely important, except in the context of Islamophobia, which Anna touched on earlier on. I mean, actually, to be honest, Islamophobia is a much more serious issue for all of us around the world, wherever we live, than Russophobia, because that is real prejudice, and it is covering in such an ignorant way and suggesting that any Muslim is a threat.
Well, Jonathan, I'm glad you're bringing this up. Anna, if I can go to you, I think that what Jonathan's saying is really spot on here, because if the United States and Russia had a better relationship, maybe the Boston bombing might not have happened, because we didn't see a sharing of information, because there's a relationship between the two countries is antagonistic. Because what I would say, not everyone would agree with me, because of prejudice against Russia, because of its form of democracy, its type of society. So, I mean, Jonathan brings up a good point. I mean, Islamophobia, it's a global issue, and if Russia isn't brought on board as an equal partner, we have outcomes like Boston.
I would not characterize a relationship as antagonistic. I would characterize it as a relationship with fundamental lack of trust. And that's a very big political barrier, but I think that it also has cultural roots. It works on every level. Just my own example, I asked an agency to book me a travel and for a colleague on Aeroflot, and the colleague said, I'm not going to fly Aeroflot, I would like to come to my destination alive.
And I'd like to point out to our listeners here is that if you look at Aeroflot's international safety record, it's sterling. Absolutely.
I love flying Aeroflot.
All right, Anna, keep going.
Yeah, my daughter meets Gorbachev at a function here in London, and she comes back to the office and she has these pictures and she was very excited. And then somebody in her office says, "Oh, this guy looks dodgy, some dodgy Russian." If there is a dodgy Russian around, it is definitely not Mikhail Gorbachev. And we're talking about intellectual public. So that goes all the way through the presidency, through the people who are in decision making. Oh, can we trust these people? Surely there must be something wrong with. Even we can't quite point our finger. They might be either corrupt or drunk or not serious or not professional, or
but
they,
something
of
must
course,
be wrong.
Something must be wrong. Or there will be something human rights and how they get the evidence. We have to look for fault until we find it. And of course, if you start with that kind of aspiration in mind, and Russia is a messy country, you will have proof.
Mark, I send pictures of central Moscow to my friends back in the U.S. And the number of times, like shopping centers and, new office buildings, and I've seriously gotten responses, that can't be in Moscow. It can't be. Russia doesn't look like that. Why I'm mentioning is that, it was kind of mentioned earlier, is that this place is so monolithic, and there's no nuance. When average people, the people on this panel today are experts, but people in the U.S., people in the U.K., they get so little information, nuanced information about Russia.
When you're dealing with the people in the U.S., and I don't mean to be critical of the country of my own birth here, but they don't have a very nuanced or complex version of the world outside the U.S. to begin with. There is definitely an idea of American exceptionalism, and essentially no other country in the world has democracy, no other country in the world has civilization. Of course not at the expert level, but at the layman's level. When I immigrated to Russia, my parents came over for my wedding, and they had never left the United States in their lives before. And despite our family having some Russian ancestry, they were absolutely in shock at everything in Moscow. They were looking for bread lines. They were looking for bears in the street. They were worried about KGB agents taking them away. And this really goes to the heart of this Russophobia experience, not only at the media and the policy wonk level, but it really reaches down deep to the common people of
Okay,
of
well,
both
Jonathan,
US
you're
and
a
UK.
journalist, so, people in your trade haven't done a good job.
No, I don't think they have. And as I say, they don't travel enough. It's all about Moscow. It's all about sort of high politics, crime and so on, and they just don't describe what the real depth of Russian life is like. It's a problem all around the world now that foreign news is contracting. There's less and less foreign news on television, on the newspapers, even in the web. Unless you're a specialist, you go to the particular specialist websites you want, but in the sort of general run of things, there's very little. And it's a tragedy because under globalization and easy, free, cheap travel, we should be knowing more about the countries we visit, but we seem to know less.
Anna, how can Russia change the perception of it in the world, do you think?
I think first
Is there anything, or does Russia really have to care? Go ahead.
I think they should do two things. First, they should understand what the stereotypes are and what they derive from. And maybe there are some things which they can acknowledge. That's kind of the fact. Yes, there are rich oligarchs, and they make headlines in London. They have litigation cases, and they are high profile, and they are, frankly speaking, news because they have style, they have...
Beautiful women.
Yes, beautiful women,
Also.
yes. But then, secondly, they also should understand that they should fight certain battles and not try to take the West as a kind of different civilization as a whole. I think this idea of Russian exceptionalism should be played down or dropped altogether if it's possible, but try to really get a sense that how to talk to Western media constituency on its own terms, but also realize that Russians will never be loved. They can be accepted more.
All right, I'm going to jump. That's an
That's
point.
the reality, and it's easier to accept it rather than all the time say why we're not European, why the West do not see us as such.
Well, I don't know why any people should be loved here. Let me jump in here. Welcome to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Mark, you were shaking your head. Go ahead.
I respectfully am going to have to disagree with Ada there. If we take a look at this phenomenon that we're talking about, Russophobia, we are looking at a particularly Russia-West complex. The rest of the world does not have the same phobias to the Russia anywhere close to the extent. And we're living in a multipolar world that is slowly emerging. We don't have to cater, speaking of Russia, we don't have to cater everything towards an extremely ethnocentric West anymore. We have good relations with much of the rest of the world. The West is not the international community. It does not speak for it. And to deny the uniqueness of Russia and of a wider Eurasian civilization to try to fit into a West that will never accept us simply isn't needed anymore.
But I think that's the key point. Russia and Russians want to be accepted in the West as equal, as part of the same civilization. It is existentially important. That's why they care. And secondly, the fact that Putin creates that kind of alternative pole of attraction, that's also a very big irritant, even if it's just a symbolic stake. I landed in Colombo in Sri Lanka, and the first thing which I see notices and portraits of Putin and great things which he said about struggle against terrorism. So it is a pole of attraction, and because it is gaining some kind of momentum, that would add just fuel to the fire.
Well, I just wanted to say,
Go ahead.
Anna talks about Russians will never be loved. I don't think any people will ever be loved as long as they're stereotypes. I don't think it matters. I mean, the fact is that people have different compartments. One compartment is Russian literature. There's tremendous admiration for Russian literature. We've talked about Dostoevsky briefly. There's tremendous admiration for Russian music, Tchaikovsky and Rimsky-Korsakov and ballet and so on. There's great respect for Russian mathematics and chess. There's a sense that Russians have a brilliant mathematical brains. So that, all that goes into the mix. And when it comes to foreign policy, then on occasion there is an antagonism about the foreign policy. But I think the average person in the street in this country, in Britain, where I'm speaking from, has a more positive than negative view of Russia because of its long European tradition and heritage and so on. And in the Soviet Union, it was different. When the Soviet Union existed, it was different because people in Britain then had fear pushed down their throats all the time by the media, and there was some basis for that. Now there's no reason to fear Russia, and I don't think most British people do fear Russia.
I disagree. I will have to say I heard in quite public venues things about Russians are being said which is impossible to say about other people because that would be definitely not on. So I do not think that people have a very positive view on Russians. I think the immediate reaction is more to look for something negative and then to be pleasantly surprised if negative stereotypes do not apply to a particular person of acquaintance.
Anna, I gave a talk in Poland about a year and a half ago, and people looked at me as an oddity because I was saying things what I think is basically objectively true about Russia, and the Poles went nuts. They couldn't believe it. I said, it's a problem that NATO conducts illegal wars around the world, and I was almost ushered out of the room. We've talked about Russophobia in its different forms here, but you know what? Russia still counts. And this is, one of the... John Kerry was here, the most red-faced diplomat I've seen in years, patting Lavrov on the backs, thanking Vladimir Putin, because the Americans are in a mess in Syria and their Western allies are in a mess in Syria, and Russia maybe could help them out. My point is that you still have to deal with Russia even though you may have an antithetical point of view to what they're thinking about.
Absolutely. Russia is a P5 member of the Security Council. We are either the first or the second most nuclear armed nation in the world. We have an actually growing economy compared to the West. The really hard fact that I think much of the Western elites have with Russia is that they need us more than we need them. They need Russia to impose their sense of global order on North Korea, on Iran, on Syria, on these trouble spots. And Russia uniquely has both the ability and the political will to deny that. And because there's so little economic relations, particularly with the United States and the United Kingdom, they really don't have much leverage left anymore. There's not enough treats that they can hand out
Well, Jonathan, if I can go to you, it kind of goes back to one of my original questions, is that, should the Russians really care about their image in the world, considering what Mark just said?
No, I don't think they should. I quite agree, and that's why I slightly disagreed also with Anna when she said Russians need to be loved. I don't think they need to worry about whether they're loved or not. If they're hated and feared, then it is important, but I don't think they are, as I keep saying. Russia has its own interests, its own national interests, its independence, and it must take its course in the world as it sees fit. It doesn't have to kowtow to anybody at all.
Anna, when I was growing up, I'm an American. I grew up in Colorado and California, and there were a lot of ethnic communities around me, and we had stereotypes of people around us, humorous stories, humorous imagery. It was very rarely mean-spirited. Do you think that in our lifetime, Russians will be treated the same way, as a certain kind of stereotype, the costume or something like that, that's basically harmless?
I don't think so. I think that there are too many Russians.
Why?
And
too many Russians.
yeah, there are too many different Russians.
Everybody says that on vacation these days. Too many Russians around me.
Yes, yeah, and in some ways it is quite odd, because in some way you can say that Russians are very much integrated. There are lots of middle-class Russians traveling abroad and doing all sorts of ordinary things, and it's not just like it was 10 years ago. They were very rich men, and they were drinking disproportionately. So in that sense, it takes a little bit of sense of Russians being exotic. But on the other hand, Russians are kind of existentially, or in terms of entertainment and image, it is a helpful enemy image to have. And I think unless you replace it with something, and I didn't quite see what it can be, if you take Martians and aliens out, what would be more convenient than Russian?
Yeah, I guess the Chinese can't take that one because people are afraid of the Chinese now. Mark, go ahead.
Simply because of the business and economic opportunities that China presents, China never falls under the same level of scrutiny. No country falls under the same level. Well,
maybe
Iran and North Korea, Syria, okay. Other than...
But Mark, you just said it. I'm flabbergasted. Russia, North Korea, and Iran.
The rogue states.
All in the same category, so very different.
I think you make a good point about China.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
I think there is Sinophobia. Fear of China is actually stronger than Russophobia, because it's again the foreign policy thing. I think Russia is no longer seen as expansionist, whereas China is. Of course, it's early stages, as the Americans think and say, and the Pentagon's gearing up slowly to some confrontation with China. So China, I think, is the enemy that's coming over the horizon, unfortunately, in terms of media images, whereas Russia, I think, is no longer in that position.
I would also say that to what extent all this matters. And I think that Russophobia matters because it creates fundamental distrust, which prevents solving things which can be solved. As we just seen, cooperation with Boston bombing could have been better, and this tragedy could have been avoided. Yes, we also look at Afghanistan. That would be a crucial junction. Of course, cooperation between Russia and the West, and especially the United States, is important and will be even more important. We look at other international issues of tensions like North Korea, where you need really partners to pull together, because fundamentally they share the same values.
And I love ending a program on a positive note. Jonathan, Anna, and Mark here in the studio with me in Moscow. Thank you for joining me here on Debating Russia on Voice of Russia. Stay with VOA. Welcome to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. I'm your host, Peter Lavelle. Russophobia is real and impacts how many in the world understand geopolitics, culture, and history. So where does Russophobia come from, and is there anything we can do to counteract it? To discuss this, I'm joined by my guest in London, Jonathan Steele. He is a columnist at The Guardian and an author. We also have Anna Matveeva. She is a visiting senior research fellow, Department of War Studies, King College, London. And also sitting here with me in Moscow is Mark Lavelle. He is a senior lecturer and researcher at Moscow State University. Jonathan, if I can go to you first, what is Russophobia?
Well, actually, I think it's a hangover from Sovietophobia. I think when the Soviet Union existed, there was massive pressure and media coverage of bad things happening in the Soviet Union, and of course it was considered to be the strategic enemy of NATO and all that kind of thing. I think where there is still some Russophobia, it's just a hangover from that. I think it's probably more actually not so much phobia, which means theoretically, fearing Russians. I think it's just stereotypes and prejudice and incorrect or distorted images. I don't think people are actually afraid of Russians. They may be afraid of Russia as a state because of some of its foreign policy, but not of Russians.
Okay, but Anna, there are so many stereotypes about Russians around the world, and extremely negative ones, I would say. I watched the film Armageddon recently, and it's a fantastic film and all that, but the cosmonaut is a drunkard, an idiot, a buffoon. The Soviet Union contributed a lot to space exploration, but we still get these stereotypes of Russians. Why?
When I first came to live in the West, in London, that was about 20 years ago, Soviet Russians, just started to emerge on the scene. There were two stereotypes about us. One was that we're prepared to do anything what it takes to stay in the Western paradise, so that we are not thrown out in the cold. And second stereotype was Cinderella goes to the market and she will behave like a Dostoevsky heroine. So everybody who read, an Idiot or other great pieces of Russian literature expected everybody to act as a character from a Dostoevsky novel.
So, Anna, it seems to me that means that being in the West, in this case, in London, in your case here with Jonathan, that tells me that Western people don't know anything about Russians if you're giving such a vivid stereotype, two different stereotypes that are not even real.
But that happened about 20 years ago. What happened then was that Russians did not live up to either of these two stereotypes. They were things which developed in the process of Russia becoming a new state and also with the new cultural attributes. And in that sense, I'm not sure whether I share Jonathan's maxim that Russophobia is a leftover of Sovietophobia. I would say that quite a lot of stereotypes, both cultural and political, are product of the modern times and perhaps of the last 10 years, and especially since Vladimir Putin came to power.
Okay, I was going to say we'll talk about Putin phobia a little bit later here. Mark, Russophobia goes all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars.
Exactly. I think it goes further than that. Russophobia is just another variant of Orientalism, as Said defined it. It's relying on one-dimensional characters of Russian cultural reality as one of millennial despotism, contempt for the individual, so on. We can observe this sheer disconnect between Russian reality, and Russian reality is represented in Western texts and media, not just today, not just in the Soviet era, but this goes back to the 1830s. I was reading a text from the Napoleonic era today from 1839 that spoke about a thin veneer of European civilization on Russia that was barely credible.
So what you're saying is that that's the reference point. Jonathan, Mark's onto something here, is that Russia has been the other for geopolitical reasons for about 200 years.
I can really only talk about, what the feeling is in Britain. Because every country has its different stereotypes of foreigners. In Britain, I think people actually, if you're talking about phobia, the literal meaning being fear, British people are still more afraid of Germany than they are of Russia. I don't think most British people fear Russia. They have these stereotypes. Now the new stereotype is these oligarchs. The Russians are all terribly rich. They're terribly vulgar. They love bling. They love throwing their money around, as though, everybody in Russia is a billionaire. Of course, we know that that's only a tiny minority.
That sounds like envy to me.
For some people, it may be a combination of envy, but for other people, I think, who have known Russia for a long time, there is something sad about the way the oligarchs behave and the way they get excessive publicity. So there's blame on both sides. But I do think the Russian rich give a very bad image of their country, and it's not correct in the sense it's not typical. I think most Russians are extremely cultured, very gentle, kind.